Have you ever had a bad boss and wondered what you could do to cope? Or maybe you weren't sure whether or not you had a bad boss? Well, the book I'm going to be summarizing today might be able to help you. And the book we're going to be reviewing is How to Lead by John Maxwell. And the subtitle is When Your Boss Can't or Won't. So basically, how to lead when you have a bad boss. I read this book as a request to a viewer on YouTube. In the comments, they asked me to read a couple books, and this was one of them. And I really enjoyed the way this book started out, but the way it ended up is not what I liked, and I'll be talking about that through this video. This book is 6 chapters, and it's a pretty short book. It's written more of like a blog post as far as I'm concerned. And I'm going to be going through each one of the chapters in the book briefly. But as a general concept, the book starts out talking about bad bosses, the types of bad bosses and like the bad decisions they make. And then it comes up with solutions for how to treat these bad bosses, or basically how you cope in the situations if you have a bad boss. And the way you cope are the following chapters. And the list of those ways are: you can lead yourself before anything else, which is chapter 2. You can find ways to work with your boss, which is chapter 3. You can develop your influence wherever you are, and that's chapter 4. And you can avoid landmines that make the situation worse. That's chapter 5. And lastly, you can prove your worth daily and never stop growing. And that's chapter 6. Chapter 1 is what happens when bosses don't lead. And the way each chapter goes, it has like small paragraphs with like a title above them. And in here it says like what happens when bosses don't lead. And what happens is decisions are delayed, agendas are multiplied, conflicts are extended, morale becomes low, production is reduced, and success is difficult. And from my experience, a lot of this stuff is true. I mean, I have a lot of corporate experience. I've been working in the corporate world for over 11 years. And so this chapter was really good. I identified with this. I've had a lot of bad bosses. I've had some good bosses, but a lot of this stuff is true. And some of the things that resonate with me is like decisions are delayed. Bad bosses like never want to make decisions, because what decisions mean is things can get put back on them, and they'll avoid making decisions unless someone above them tells them it's a good decision. And success is difficult. I agree with that as well. And that was one of my favorite things in this book. Is the author said that scarcity mindset is the root of most conflict in like corporate environments. And I believe that's true. And if it's scarcity mindset, then of course that means that success is going to be difficult, because an insecure boss isn't going to want to promote people, isn't going to want to help people. And so success in a company with bad leaders or bad bosses is going to be very difficult. Another thing that is really helpful about this book and in this chapter is it lists the types of bad bosses. And the types of bad bosses are insecure leaders, visionless leaders, incompetent leaders, self-centered leaders, chameleon leaders, political leaders, and controlling leaders. And I agree with all of those as well. And typically, to me, the bad leaders aren't one of these. They're multiple. They have multiple of these characteristics. Like most of the bad leaders are political leaders, and that's kind of one of the situations I'm in right now. My boss is like highly political. One of my bosses is highly political, and it just makes doing your job a lot harder because they're always worried about appearances. And John Maxwell talks about later about like how to deal with that, or like how to deal with it yourself. So that's how this book starts out, right? It starts out with the bad bosses, who they are, and what they do to sort of screw up the company and screw up your life. And then the following chapters are, well, I thought were going to be about like how to get yourself out of those situations. And it is in those chapters, right? It's in the chapters we're about to go over, but for the most part, it's just like how to be a good employee. I don't view these things as ways to get out from under a bad boss. I view them more as like how to be a good employee no matter what. Because a lot of times if you're under a bad boss, there's not much you can do, even if you do a lot of these great things, because they make your life a living hell. So the best thing in my advice, if you have a really bad boss and you can get out of the situation, get out of it. And if you can't get out, then make sure you can't really get out, right? Don't just give up. You have to believe that you're capable of more and deserving of more, otherwise you'll never get it. But working for a bad boss can be really miserable. But if you do have to stay there, then John Maxwell has some advice for you. And we'll cover that in the next chapter. So chapter 2 of How to Lead. This chapter is called Lead Yourself Well Before Anything Else. And I'm only going to be covering like the tips that I thought were good or things that I want to discuss, because there's like 5 million tips in this book. Like I tell you, it's like a blog post. There's like 5 million paragraphs, and some of them are just like generic, like do a good job or work hard or shut up and put your head down. I don't think he says that, but it's basically that. And I don't agree with a lot of those, because you could mindlessly work and then you still get no credit for it. So the 2 best points from this chapter of leading yourself well before anything else that I have is you need to manage your emotions, and you also need to see yourself as an agent of change. So leading yourself, you do need to be able to manage your emotions. You can't get worked up. In my experience either, a lot of times I let my emotions get to me too at work. And whether it's at work or in your personal life, you have to check your emotions, because if you get too emotional, then you're probably going to do bad things. If you get too sad, too happy, or anything, you just have to manage your emotions, especially if you're dealing with a bad boss that can be toxic. You can't let them get to you, because a lot of times that's what they want to do. And you need to just find a way to deal with that. And that's one recommendation I have for this book too. If you're going to stay with the bad boss and deal with all this stuff, is get a therapist, because you can talk about the things that annoy you and they can check you and then make sure you don't send yourself off the rails. And the next tip that I like from this chapter is see yourself as an agent of change. And this is helpful for leading yourself, because you'll feel helpless if you don't feel like you can change the environment you're in. And if you have a bad leader, you can change it for yourself just by having a positive outlook and having good expectations. Maybe not within this company, but for your own future, see yourself as an agent of change. And even within the company, having a positive attitude or trying to help the people below you or just the company at large, it can really help you lead yourself. So that's really all that I took away from chapter 2. Let's move on to chapter 3. Now chapter 3 is find ways to work with your boss. So if you have a bad boss that doesn't want to lead, John Maxwell still recommends working with them. And the ways you work with them is as follows. Don't point out your boss's weaknesses. Work with your boss's strengths. Publicly say good things about your leader, and help take work off your boss's plate. Those are the things I wrote down about this chapter. And out of those, I think the best one is publicly say good things about your leader. I think this can help you in any way. And I view that as political. He later tells you, I'll talk about it, that to say not to be political within a company, but publicly saying good things about your leader is like calculating and as maneuvering. And to me, that's political. But it's good, right? Because it'll get back to your boss, and they'll think of you in a positive manner if they previously thought of you in a negative manner. And that's really hard to do when you view somebody as negative. It's hard to go tell other people that they're a good person, but I think it's a good advice, and I really like that advice. And I recommend it to anybody that is in a corporation. Another thing is help take work off your boss's plate. You have to be careful here, because bad bosses will just like dump a ton of work on you. So that's one part where I don't like about this book is that he has a lot of things like that. But if your boss is buried in work, and let's say you have a downtime or a down period in your schedule, then you should go in there and check on them and see if you can help them out. And that's just a good way to move up and get on your boss's good side. So that's pretty much all I took away from chapter 3. Let's move on to chapter 4. So chapter 4 is develop your influence wherever you are. And in this chapter is mainly about just developing influence in general, whether you're in the lowest level of the step ladder or you're higher up. And he says you shouldn't be developing your influence until you get to the top of the organization. You have to be preparing your whole career to have influence. Being a leader, according to John Maxwell, is having influence. Another good quote that I took away from this section is people should strive for the top of their game, not the top of their organization. And this means just being the best that you can be, and then quit aiming for the top, because getting to the top isn't always in your hands, right? And he also says in this section that good leaders create more good leaders, which I agree with. It takes somebody that can lead and teach to develop the people underneath them. You can't be a bad leader and develop good people, even though it is possible, just because good people are good people. Another good piece of advice from this chapter is that you can test your influence skills by trying to lead volunteers. So volunteer for an organization and try to lead people. And the reason he says to do this is because the volunteers aren't paid. When you pay people, they're most likely going to do what you tell them to do. But if you don't pay anybody anything, they have no reason to follow you. So you can use your skills in a volunteer organization to see if you are able to influence people. So that's chapter 4. Moving on to chapter 5, another way to lead people and get away from your bad boss is to avoid landmines. The way you can do that is stay away from office politics. And when I took my notes, I didn't write that much about this chapter because I feel like avoiding landmines is pretty obvious, and a lot of the details in here were pretty obvious. It's basically like, don't sabotage yourself, don't be grumpy, all that type of stuff. But the thing I took from here that stood out to me is he said stay away from office politics, which to me doesn't really make sense because that's just part of working in corporate America. There's politics. You can't not do it. It's just part of operating. But he says that people who are political are two-faced because they are ruled by their desire to get ahead. And I don't agree with this. I guess his definition of office politics is somebody that's trying to get ahead. But I feel like office politics is just maneuvering, right? You work with the people that are going to help you in your career, and you try not to work with people that aren't going to help you. And you figure out the systems in your corporation that work, and you maneuver around those. I don't view those always as bad. And it's part of working in a large organization. They're going to have a bunch of policies and rules that don't make any sense. And you have to follow them and you have to not follow them. And sometimes you have to say that you did certain things when you actually didn't. It's just part of the game. But I just found that interesting that he said that. Like, I understand what he means by not playing office politics. He means don't stab people in the back. Don't sacrifice people, things like that. But I don't think that's all there is to office politics. But in general, in this chapter, he basically means, you have a bad boss. Don't make a bad situation worse by stepping on a bunch of landmines. The last chapter, chapter 6, is prove your worth daily and never stop growing. And the way he says you can do this, the most important things that I took away are talk with others on a higher level than you, produce when the load is heavy, practice your craft, do jobs others won't, work in obscurity, and be the first to step up and help. Now, a lot of this, again, to me, this is just stuff you should follow if you're at the beginning of your career. Do jobs others won't. I think that's important in the beginning of your career, but later on, I don't think you should. You have to be careful when you do that in corporate America, because if somebody's not doing a certain thing, it's probably because it's really difficult and you're not going to get credit for it. In my company, there's tons of administrative stuff that you can do, and nobody's going to care if you did a good job on it or how long you worked on it. You're just not going to get credit for it. And working in obscurity, that's not good either, because to me, I wrote that down because I wanted to point this out about the book. You can't work in obscurity and expect to get credit. You need to take credit for things. You don't have to be boastful, and that's what he means. Don't walk around talking about how great of a person you are. I agree. But when you do a good job or a good project, you need to make sure you take credit for it. Be the first to step up and help. I agree with that when it's beneficial to you, and I guess that's a little bit of politics. You should always do that. You should try to help, and when you step up and help, you should step up and help the most important people, and that's another political thing to me. But I agree with that when it's beneficial to you. Practicing your craft, that one's really good too. Whatever is the most important skill in your company, you should constantly practice it and get better at it. This is where I don't agree with the politics part. You shouldn't be getting better at office politics. It's better to get better at the craft of your business and develop that skill and deliver value to the company. Talk with others on a higher level than you. That piece of advice I agree with as well. You're going to get better by talking with people above you, and they'll know your name. And this is where you should take credit with things when you talk to those people. You should speak to them about all the good work you've done. So that's my summary of how to lead and what I took away from the book. I think this book is good if you're at the beginning of your career and you need some advice before you start your career, or if you're worried about whether or not you have a bad boss. But if you've been in corporate America for a really long time, I don't think you need this book. I think you've run into a lot of these situations, and the tips in here are just way too generic. You can just read blogs about corporate America, like hbr.org, and you'll get better advice than this. So that's what I'd say about this book. But also, it's really good at defining the types of bad bosses. So if you also want to outline the types of bosses you might run into, that's what else is good for. But it's a really short read, so if you want to read a little bit about leadership, then go ahead and read it. And I'll include a link to my notes and my summary of it. Let me know in the comment section if you've ever had a bad boss and the things you struggle with them, and maybe like any tips you have in dealing with the bad boss. And also make sure to like this video and subscribe if you want to see my other book summaries and reviews and recommendations. Thanks for watching.